So let me start today, because today it's an important day for EMEA, where we are launching the COVID-19 Policy Response Monitor, which is a dynamic open access research tool. You find it available on the website of EMEA. The purpose is mainly to monitor, when possible, to assess the evolution and the policy responses related to the pandemic in Europe, the Mediterranean, and Africa. When we started our research initiative, that was on the 18th of March 2020, as soon as the pandemic started, we have developed a three-pillar framework to monitor and assess the policy responses for the overall effectiveness in terms of the flattening of the curve, the pandemic curve, and also returning to the economies into sustainable recovery. And these three pillars are preparedness of healthcare systems. The second is the timeliness and intensity of the containment policies. And the third pillar is the preparedness and comprehensiveness of the socioeconomic mitigation policies. So this I would call the framework for assessment, for monitoring, will allow us really to develop a number of indicators to monitor the situation in these three regions. So let me start with the first pillar, which is the healthcare system preparedness. The healthcare system, based on our assessment in the North Mediterranean, except for Malta, were seemingly prepared, according to the data from the Global Health Security Index, where all the scores were above the world average. So theoretically, all the health systems in the North Mediterranean, except for Malta, were prepared for this pandemic. Now, in the South Mediterranean and East Mediterranean, of course, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, and Turkey scores were above the world average. All the rest were below, so less prepared, of course. In the sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa were much above the world, were above the world average. And then, of course, all the rest in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and South Mediterranean were below. But then when we've seen how the pandemic has hit Spain and Italy, although the health system were seemingly very strong and very resilient, I would call the magnitude of the shock of this pandemic were really very powerful, that even the health system, the healthcare systems of these two countries, Spain and Italy, could not cope with the situation. Now, looking at the second pillar, which is the containment policies, we've seen that in many countries, and all the globe, in fact, there has been a confinement, and some of the countries today, they are already decontainment or lifting these containment measures. Now, looking at the North Mediterranean, the countries that implemented strict containment measures, but then delayed from when the first case was detected, but also with some varied intensity levels. When I say intensity, is really the enforcement of these containment measures. For example, some countries have applied penalties, and even sometimes if the citizens are not respecting the containment measures, for example, the lockdown, they had even some big problems in some countries. Now, looking at certain countries, for example, in the case of France, the delayed answer, it's almost 54 days from the day they detected the first case, which is quite very high if you compare to other countries. If looking, for example, also at Spain, it's 44 days. And also they have adopted a very intense type of containment measures. They even scored 9, Spain, out of 10. So we created a score which allowed to really see where are the countries relative to each other. Italy, 25 days from the first day when they detected the first case, and they also scored 9. So not only they, but then obviously you will see later on when we look at the sub-Saharan Africa, we could see a kind of a reverse tendency, where in reality the containment measures were much less strict, but then in majority of the cases they were implemented very quickly, with also varied intensity levels. For example, in Mauritius, after 7 days from when they detected the first case, they implemented the containment policies. And then in terms of intensity, they were less intense, less around a score 4. Republic of Congo, it's also 9 days from the first day they detected the first case, and then they scored in terms of intensity 5. Now, in the Southeast Mediterranean, the picture is a little bit heterogeneous, with countries like, for example, Tunisia. They implemented very strict containment measure quite quickly, also 10 days from the day they detected the first case, and with high intensity. They scored 9, as comparable to, in fact, to Spain. But others, such as Turkey, they opted for loose and less intense measures, score 5, but then adopted at a much later stage. And then and here it's 33 days. So you can see the information on screen. Now, we also try to look at the effectiveness of these measures, at least, in a preliminary manner, because we still are doing our research to complete this picture. We looked at 3 indicators, which are, in our opinion, very important indicators to assess the effectiveness of the pandemic. One is the testing. Second is the variation of cases and death. Okay. Now, the testing has been very controversial everywhere. That's clear. There has been a lot of debate about whether this testing have been generalized and effective. Now, if we look at the numbers, just simple numbers, the tests performed have been really insufficient to provide a clear, reliable picture on the evolution of the pandemic, or on the I would call it more, on the pandemic as a whole. In the North Mediterranean, the average number of tests per million performed is 71,000, a little bit more, which is higher than the Southeast Mediterranean, 15,000, a little bit more. And then in the Sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about 12,000 per million, which is quite low. Testing is sometimes in Sub-Saharan countries, they are almost sometimes not available. The data is not available there. Now, if we look at some countries that are really being quite active in testing, we can look, for example, at the data up to the 1st of June. Malta, Israel, and Mauritius, they reached respectively 157,000, 61,000, and 91,000 tests per million, which is quite higher in this region we are assessing. Now, in the 3 regions studied, we observe also, which is good news, a decreasing trend in cases, but also in terms of the death. And this is also good news. At least the pandemic, it's being kind of controlled in several countries. But then we observe a very high case fatality rate, such, for example, in countries like in France, Italy, and Spain. So the last part of my introduction today, and I hand over to Cinzia, is really the what I call the socio-economic preparedness. And this is quite interesting because the socio-economic preparedness and resilience to external shocks were quite heterogeneous in the Mediterranean and Sub-Saharan Africa. In the North Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, and Spain. In the South Mediterranean, Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia. In Sub-Saharan Africa, Cameroon, DRC, Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal were the least economically prepared. Now, if we look at the data for Europe, and then we can see the slide, countries that were the least economically prepared suffered the most in terms of the propagation of the disease. Of course, we need to do more research to assert this conclusion. Now, the main divergences that we observe between the different countries, and I'm not going to go into details, you can check the details on the website, is the quality of institution, the fiscal and monetary space, the predominance of economic sectors that are particularly exposed in the lockdown measures, for example, tourism, leisure, and others, and the construction of the global value chain. Now, it is also important to emphasize that public social protection and banking soundness means, you know, the level of capital that they already started with and so on, are very key indicators to assess resilience and preparedness. So with this introduction, I would like to give the floor to Cinzia Alsidi. As you know, in Europe, there has been a clear push to move into a recovery plan. And I think Cinzia can share with us this very important development in Europe, which in fact will move certain countries into, I would call, a sustainable recovery path. Cinzia, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Rim, and good afternoon to everyone. It is really a pleasure to be in this webinar. It's a personal pleasure because of the people involved. It's really nice to see you, even if only on screen, and also because I think it's a good opportunity to have this discussion about how the COVID-19 crisis has been hitting some countries, the reaction to the crisis, and basically how the recovery can be shaped. Let me share with you my screen just to be able to to share some specific thoughts looking in particular at the EU. Let me start with the onset. Rim already said a few things about the situation of some countries in the EU. I think it's quite interesting to know that basically, if we look at the spread of what has turned out to be a pandemic, outside China, which was of course the first country where the virus started, basically Europe, so an advanced economy region, has been basically the main center of the disease. This is a bit of a novelty compared to all the disease which we got to know basically over the last decades. And in particular, Italy was the first country to be hit, where the COVID-19 crisis basically started. And then it spread, and the intensity of the contagion was particularly high in Spain, France, but also Belgium, and now we are seeing the UK. While in other countries, like for instance Germany, the contagion was very much under control since the beginning. Now, this of course, the contagion has a first impact on the health sector, and the priority based basically to save lives. And basically, we rediscovered that for a virus, for which there is no vaccine, there is no cure, basically the response is the same response that we had in the medieval times when a known disease appeared. And quarantine and social distancing have emerged as being basically the only tools we have. On this, allow me just to say that I don't know if you know, but the terms quarantine comes from the Italian in the medieval times, which means 40 days. And basically 40 days was the time that was given by doctors at that time when basically bacteria and infections were not known, but it was well understood that in order to avoid the spread, the ill person had to be in isolation. And basically it was considered necessary for this person to stay 40 days on, simply because 40 days is a number which has a high religious significant mean for Christians in the Middle Age. So in this sense, it's quite interesting that in the times of digitalization, technology, and artificial intelligence, actually to face a certain crisis, we still need to use the certain kind of responses. With that said, basically, if we want to focus on the economic dimension, the result of what we now call the lockdown, so the forced social distancing and then quarantine in a sense, has been major on the economy. And I just want to show you, without going too much into the details, the projections which have been prepared by the ECB. These are different scenarios about the economic impact. I mean, of course, there is still a high uncertainty because basically the impact will depend on the duration of the lockdown. Now, measures, as Rim said, are being relaxed. So we have to see at what speed actually the economy can go back functioning at more or less full speed, and whether all the phases or lockdown will be necessary. What is very clear is that the fall in real GDP is very large, and basically for 2020 varies between -10 or even almost close to -20. So this is, of course, it's very difficult to come up with a clear number, but this is just to say that the impact on the economy is major. Also, an important issue is whether the economy will be able to recover and to go as before the crisis, or whether the gap basically is going to remain there for a long time. Now, the responses have been basically designed in the early stage at a national level, and mostly through fiscal discretionary measures in order to contain the fallout. I mean, of course, the ability to respond has been different across countries. As Rim said, actually, countries had a different fiscal space in order to basically inject money in the economy in order to mitigate the fact that both demand and the supply were basically constrained and cut, but also depending on the needs. Because as I said earlier, Germany, for instance, has been, the spread has been under control since the beginning. So in fact, the lockdown has never been full like in Italy or even in Belgium. So basically, countries have adopted different, same measures at different intensity, depending on the needs and depending on the fiscal space. But mostly, in most cases, basically an immediate fiscal impulse, mostly to the health system, but also to support to companies, especially SMEs, which represent the main fabric of the economy, were combined with tax deferral and then injections of liquidity and extension of guarantees. So these have been basically the three main sort of response measures adopted by the different countries. Now, there were also two other responses. The monetary policy response, I mean, of course, in the euro area, the ECB is the only central bank which controls monetary policy. And the interventions were basically aiming at restoring the functioning of financial markets. So very big uncertainty induced by the pandemic, which generated quite a lot of instability. And then making sure that the monetary policy stance was accommodative. So the main tools of the ECB have been injections of liquidity and liquidity availability to banks. We cannot forget that basically the European economy was coming out of a huge financial crisis, which started. So the situation is better, but the impact of this crisis is clearly very large. And the special measure that the ECB put in place, so-called PEP, the Pandemic Emerging Purchase Program, which was initiated in March and basically foresee a purchase of up to 750 billion of assets, both private and public. So bonds issued by companies, but also government. And up to now, the purchases have been almost 1/3 of the entire amount, which has been initially foreseen. Last but not least, I mean, of course, in the European context, it's also important to look at what is the common response, so beyond the response of individual member states. And here there are two different and important dimensions. So the first response of the EU has been basically suspending all the rules constraining fiscal policy or the intervention on governments in the market. And on the other side, to support the healthcare system, but also research, for instance, funding for searching a vaccine, but also information campaign, because we had a lot of issues with disinformation related to the pandemic. And then what it came up for just a few days ago, more recently, is a full recovery plan. So basically, we are clearly shifting the focus of the intervention from mitigation, if you want, to a recovery plan. So it is very crucial that the economy is put in a situation to grow again. And the Commission came up with a proposal called the Next Generation EU. It's the main new tool for the recovery, which has been put in place, whereby basically the EU is supposed to borrow, and it's the first time that we have a proposal for EU common borrowing of up to 750 billions in order to support member states and especially investment in two key areas, digital and climate. There is this idea of initiating, if you want, economic growth and driving it on two main pillars, green and digital. I will stop it here. I don't want to take too much time, and I also want to give the opportunity to others to present responses in the other countries in the South Mediterranean. And I suggest we start with Rim, who will present the response, the situation and the response in Tunisia.
Thank you, Cinzia. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I will quickly present the case of Tunisia. To start, I can say that today the health situation is under control in Tunisia. As said by Rim, Tunisia managed well the health crisis with proactive action. The sanitary strategy was put in place very early, and it was very effective. So now, after almost 3 months from the first detected case, we have around 1,086 cases, declared cases. We have 49 deaths and around 965 recovered. And that's why the authorities have decided to gradually lift the lockdown since the 4th of May, because we face a critical economic situation with a deep recession.
Rim, can you go in a full screen mode, please?
Okay. So as many as all the other countries, the Tunisian government has taken several economic and social measures since the end of March, going from social transfers to poor families to supports to enterprises, loans and guarantee for SMEs. And the last one, the last measure was decided 1 week ago on 28th of May, where the Central Bank of Tunisia has established a circular allowing banks to provide companies with exceptional financing the operating cycle in order to ensure the sustainability and to avoid the firm's exit. And this is a form of credit over 7 years with 2 years of grace and many ease of reimbursement. In all, from the beginning of the crisis, the Tunisian government has mobilized about 1 billion euro, which represents 1.8% of GDP. And I think that this is too small if we compare this with the packages mobilized by the developed countries. As you can see from this graph, this is too small, even for the for the African countries. This is too small. It could exceed 10% in for certain developed countries, and I think that this will deepen the global inequality. I think that the recovery will be more difficult for our countries. The recovery will be slower in our countries, and at another hand, this crisis will also deepen the inequality within countries, pushing millions of people into poverty, especially informal workers, workers in the most affected sector, etc. At another hand, the Tunisian government is facing several implementation problems, as delays, cumbersome procedures, errors in targeting beneficiaries, unsuitable aid distribution channels, and all these highlights our structural problems regarding the administrative burden, and regarding our digital gap, and the delay in reform implementations. Let me briefly present some economic impacts at short term. As you can see from these graphs, we can see a severe drop in exports over the first quarter of 2020. You can also see from the second graph a significant increase in inflation, which is mainly due to market shortages. In the first quarter of 2020, GDP decreased by 1.7%. We expect about between 4 and 7% decline in GDP in 2020, with an unemployment rate of 19%, compared to 15% in 2019. We also registered a fall in tourism receipts, a fall in remittances, and we expect the budget deficit, a budget deficit of more than 5% of GDP in 2020. I would like to end on a positive note, and I would like to recall that despite all that, this crisis gives rise to some opportunities. As we say in French, de la contrainte naît la créativité. Creativity comes from constraints. So this crisis was an opportunity to switch to telework in many cases. Also to switch to e-learning, which is used in extent today in Tunisia. Online bills payment to avoid movements. A significant increase in online sales, and the mobile payment applications, as the government had to implement mobile payment under constraints in order to distribute aid for poor people. So at the end, I could say that these opportunities should be seized and should push the government and different actors to move more quickly toward digital transformation. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rim. I think this was very interesting. I think it was also very nice to end on a positive note, and the role of digitalization. Now, actually, this crisis is going to push us to to accelerate with certain shifts and trends towards new ways of working. On this, I would like to leave the floor to Samir to learn about the situation in Palestine. Samir, the screen is yours.
So I started with good news that containment is successful. The number of cases since the report that appeared in the policy paper, since then we have marginal increase. The total number for today is 461. Today we witnessed 6 cases, 3 in Gaza and 3 in the West Bank. But this is not, the number is quite reasonable. The deaths is 3. We have 3 cases since the beginning, and the containment process started being lifted since the May 25. My presentation focus or totally focus on the impact so far, the assessment that have been done to the economy and to the fiscal and social areas. Let me read it so I can manage to honor the time allocated to me. On May 25, the Palestinian Authority announced the lifting of the lockdown and the gradual getting back to normal. The decision, which came after 70 days, 15 of them partial, followed by 55 days of comprehensive lockdown. The decision excluded the high-risk activities such as education, tourism, and mass activity. Prior to COVID-19 pandemic, around a quarter of Palestinians lived below the poverty line, 53% in Gaza of households, and 14% in the West Bank. So we have a huge poverty problem before the COVID-19. A recent World Bank report estimated the ratio of poor households will increase to 64% in Gaza Strip and to 30% in the West Bank. So the poverty situation will further deteriorate. The 2.5 early World Bank projected Palestinian GDP growth for 2020 has been revised to a full year decline of at least 7.6% based on a gradual return to normality, and to 11% in the case of a slower recovery or further restrictions due to another COVID-19 outbreak. Demand from employees in the public and private sectors is expected to shrink by 25% through a combination of job losses and salary reductions of spending. Furthermore, demand of Palestinian workers in Israel is estimated to shrink by 50%. Put together, both in the for the whole labor force, the World Bank estimates a reduction in demand of some 30% in total. The BNA emergency budget, go to the financial and fiscal issues. The BNA emergency budget for 2020 projects a reduction in public revenues of 30% compared to 2019, as a result of the decline in economic activity. On the expenditure side, the budget projects a 5% increase compared to 2019, mainly driven by the wage bill and higher social spending. Put together, the total deficit is expected to reach $2.7 billion, almost 90% higher than in 2019. To finance the deficit, the budget assumes that $637 million will come from donors, from international aid, while $617 million is to be borrowed from local banks. This, of course, leaves about $1.4 billion unidentified funding. This is the financial gap. Used to be less than 300 million in the past. The impact on public finance, to continue, the World Bank expected that the BA revenue to drop by 15% in 2020 due to the slowdown in economic activity if the path of recovery is moderate. So as the BA total deficit could reach $1.6 billion in 2020. This is different than the projection of the Palestinian National Authority, which almost doubled this number. The Prime Minister has already decided to reallocate part of the salaries of public employees while protecting those that make less than 2,000 and less as a monthly salary. To keep the salaries that is 2,000 and less, to keep it going, but to cut other salaries more than the 2,000, and to be distributed, to be given this money to the most neediest families as part of the social protection package. Some financing to bridge the gap here, according to the World Bank, 200 million may be available for the domestic banking sector, from the banking sector. However, this would be viewed as the last resort, given that crowding out the private sector and adding more stress to the banking sector, which used to have to be squeezed by higher exposure to the Palestinian Authority and to the public sector employees. That's all for as you see, the situation, the fiscal situation and the economic situation deteriorated badly, despite the differences in the estimation between the World Bank and the Palestinian Authority and maybe others. The Bureau of Statistics also put its number, but all estimates shows bleak or difficult situation ahead of the Palestinian. Thank you very much for this.
Many thanks, Samir, for this overview of the situation of Palestine. Unfortunately, the picture is quite concerning when it comes to inequalities and impact on societies and society, and also on the budget of governments. Let me now move to Nooh to learn about the situation in Jordan. Nooh.
Yeah. Yeah, many thanks, first of all, Cinzia. First of all, actually, I would like to express my great pleasure to meet you again for this webinar. And I hope all of my colleagues are doing well. I would like to extend also my sincere thank to Reem. Thank you, Reem, to Kinga and George, and of all of my colleagues for their efforts actually on organizing this event. And I would like to thank my colleagues from the Jordan team, Mais Shaban and Selma Sandri, for the good cooperation to this study. Actually, concerning the case of Jordan, the first case was, excuse me, just, okay. The first case in Jordan was confirmed on the 2nd of March. And today in Jordan, we have around 757 cases with 9 death cases. And actually the confinement measure started in Jordan even before that the first case was confirmed. Exactly on the 23rd of February, the travels to selected countries in Jordan was banned. On the 15th of March, after 13 days from the first case, lockdown started by educational sectors, by touristic sites, and on the 17th of March, the defense law in Jordan was yeah, lockdown, okay. On the 17th, the defense law was declared in Jordan, and lockdowns was extended to all non-essential sectors. All flights were suspended. All public events and gatherings have been banned, and 2 weeks of quarantines have been imposed for everybody entering the country. From 20th to 24th of March, we had in Jordan a full curfew. No car movement, no person movement. Then after that, the 25th of March, small groceries started to reopen, essential basic needs also, but we had a night and a weekend curfew. And this night and weekend curfew actually valid until today. Starting by the end of April and the beginning of May, actually, okay, the government has begun to ease the confinement measures. Businesses starting by the industrial sector have been progressively allowed to reopen and to operate under a certain condition. Movement by cars has been allowed, but only under also a certain conditions. No intergovernorate trips, even and odd plate policies, okay, and with always official permit. Public sector on the 26th of May returns to the work, but also under a specific conditions. A back to work manual has been issued from the government. Just 2 hours ago, the Prime Minister has announced that almost all sectors in Jordan has to reopen. Mosques, churches, okay, restaurants and cafes will reopen on the 6th of June, the next Saturday, okay, and also under certain conditions. Overall, in general, the government were from the beginning in Jordan convinced that the social distancing and confinement measures are the only way to avoid the spread of the disease and to control it. They were strongly convinced that Jordan, given it is economic and health system capability is not in the position to face the spread of the pandemic. The policy response for the containment of a repercussions of the crisis, I will divide them actually into fiscal and monetary policy responses. The fiscal policy responses, among else, I will divide them into three categories, which is state revenues and government expenditure and labor market responses. Concerning the state revenue, the government issued defense orders, okay, that postpone until the end of the year the collect of sale taxes, and also postpone 70% of the customs duty for selected companies. They did also a reduction for social security contribution from the private sector establishment and enterprises. They impose, also the government imposed a deduction of 10% of salaries above 2,000 GT. They establish also, the government established a coronavirus relief funds under the name of Himmat Watan, okay, to collect donations from local and foreign sources. Concerning the government expenditure, the government issues defense orders to reduce its government expenditure, through cutting unnecessary costs, stopping hiring in the public sector, and also to postpone some public projects. To regulate the labor markets and to prevent the layoffs in general, the government issue also a defense order that gives the possibility for a wage reductions for the companies, to put conditions for layoffs, and also to provide the workers with some financial benefits or support. Concerning the monetary policy response in Jordan, the central bank from the beginning was actually very active, and from the beginning they issue orders to postpone the credit facility installment. They also inject additional liquidity of 550 million GD by reducing the compulsory reserves ratio from 7 to 5%. Also, they instruct the banks to extend another 500 million GT at interest rate of 2% or less for the small and medium enterprises. In March, the central bank reduced its main interest rate 2 times to reach 2.5%, which is the lowest in the history in Jordan. Concerning the exchange rate, they did nothing, no changes in the exchange rate policy, because as maybe you know, it is pegged to the US dollar. Now, the socio-economic challenges and the recovery possibility that we have in Jordan. The problem that Jordan suffer from, which are actually chronic. The real GDP growth is in 2019 2%, as a 2%, which is sluggish, which is also in the last 10 years was in that rate actually. And the expectation of the World Bank for this period, or after the COVID period, it will be around minus 3.5% in 2020. Unemployment rate is before the pandemic was very high, 19.1%, and in the first quarter is 19.3%, and is expected actually to rise. Some experts, they say it will reach around 30% in 2020. Budget deficit, it is minus 3.4% of GDP, and by the first quarter of 2020, it's around 6%, and also it's expected to increase because that the state revenue is expected to decrease in 2020. Public debt, which is a chronic problem in Jordan, it is around now 100% of GDP, and also is expected to rise due to the Eurobond outstanding payment, which are due in June 2020. Good. The question that can we ask, which policy options has the Jordanian government to make a good recovery? Okay. First of all, we can think about increase of financial support and inject further liquidity in the market as the whole economists did in the world. But this is, we know that there is a limited financial resources for the state in Jordan. The second issue, they can do a reduction of the government expenditure, and the government already start to do that by speaking about public sector reforms, okay, to cut a little bit expenditures. But this could also lead to a further unemployment, increase in the unemployment rate, and in economic contractions. Official development assistance, which is one of the main financial resources for Jordan. In the future, we believe that the donors' capability are questionable. I am almost done. Okay, state borrowing is one of the main aspects that the government can think about it, but this will also increase the burden of the public debt. And we expect that also the remittances in Jordan will decrease in the future because of the workers that they will come back from the Gulf area. I believe this is the situation in Jordan, and I hope that I'm not taking a lot of time.
Thanks very much, Nooh, for this overview. So public finances looks under stress basically everywhere. Let me now move to Kwame for the situation in Ghana.
So, hello everybody. Again, I'm very pleased to join a great panel and also speak to all of you about the situation in Ghana. In Ghana, I just want to give you a quick overview. Currently, we have about 8,500 cases. We recorded our first case on the 12th of March. Generally, I think it's been good because although we have a great number of cases, our recoveries have also been good, about 37%, which is about 3,000, over 3,000 recoveries. Unfortunately, we have about 38 deaths. So if you look at the cases versus deaths, generally, I think it hasn't been that catastrophic. Now, just to walk you through the trend in terms of the pandemic, we started with the social distancing, basically just telling people to stay apart, and then we moved slowly into some sort of closures and suspension of critical activities regarding public gatherings, festivals, and also putting some limitations on there. As the situation grew from the graph I'm showing here, we now moved to stop on international travel where our borders remain closed. Now, when anybody, if you see the trend, I mean, with the partial lockdown, we also moved into a full lockdown for about 3 weeks or so, where some major cities in Ghana were locked down fully, where only critical people could move out. Now, as of last week, we have lessened some of the measures that we've taken, and again, the indication is that the spread is going down. But as I always say, this spread and the impact, nobody knows the full extent until it really happens. But I think our expectation is that is going to go down, and hopefully we can remove some of the limitations we have on our borders and things like that. Now, with regards to the impact, to be very specific, I think some industries has had it stronger than others. Hospitality industry, for instance, a lot of our hotels here depend on international travel, and some of them have gone close to 0%. But generally, I think people in the hospitality industry has been hit significantly. Our healthcare has been okay, but the challenge we have now is that people are now a bit scared and worried to go to the hospitals for some of the normal diseases that we have in Ghana, which can also be catastrophic, like malaria, cholera, and others. But again, as I move into the government interventions, I'll be very clear as to how much health support has given. But generally, I think that our government is moving to increase the health infrastructure as much as possible to support the challenges we have. Now, for GDP, it's been projected that, assuming that this pandemic goes down as we expect by the end of this month, moving into July, we will go from about 6.8% to 2.6%. Now, that's a percentage that I believe may worsen, because I think the spread the pandemic may move further than the end of this month. But again, currently, we expect a decline to about 2.6%, which could go a bit further down. Now, commodity prices, the structure of our economy is such that we rely on oil. We also sell some gold, which interestingly, oil has come down, but gold prices has gone up. But now trade generally hasn't been the best. But again, so that mix is there. Now, let me move to the real impact in terms of measures that have been taken and how that the government has been very proactive, because we have established something called the National COVID Fund, which is supposed to support or bring all forces from the private and public sector together to provide money to help the challenge of COVID. There's a soft loan program that has been put together, about 600 million cedis, which is a little over $100 million to help with small and micro businesses. Basically, they'll receive these funds based on their ability to pay and also their need for a 2-year period. The government has also issued some interventions, such as providing 50% cut on electricity, and then also provide free water for us for about a period of 3 months. Now, moving into some monetary policies, banks have had to reduce their interest rate by 2%. The monetary policy rate has now gone down from 16 to about 14.5%. Bank of Ghana has also deferred interest payments on non-marketable instruments to 2022 and beyond. And again, as I said, with this pandemic, all these as at now, I'm sure other things, as we look at the impact, other things will happen. Now, looking at some of the physical measures as well, there's been an amendment to allow for the central bank, for the government to borrow more from the central bank again. This threshold obviously was put in there to control government's borrowing from our central bank. Again, this has become necessary. There's been a syndicated loan facility of about $3 billion to support industries, especially pharmaceutical and hospitality, as I mentioned earlier, being the most hit. Our tax filings have been extended for about 4 to 6 months. So again, organizations have about 2 extra months to file their taxes. There's been some tax waivers that has come through to, again, help organizations. Some other financial measures that have a significant, commercial banks have been asked to exploit monetary policies to support some of these critical industries that I mentioned, from pharmaceutical, hospitality, and manufacturing. There's a 6 months moratorium on some of the principal payments to kind of help these specific industries like aviation, hospitality, as I mentioned again. And also the ease on money. So mobile money is something that is picking up greatly in Ghana. And again, the daily limit has gone up just to help the social distancing measure. But generally, I think the government of Ghana has been proactive, monitoring critical business activities, social activities, and healthcare activities, and then in totality has kind of brought out these measures. I think if you look at our death to infection rate, it speaks to the fact that the people that have been infected have definitely been cured or have recovered, and the deaths have been people who definitely had some pre-existing conditions. So I think in general, for now we've done well. I think we need to do better by not extending our cases, and hopefully businesses have also opened up generally, and the hotels who have been closed for a while, I think are planning to open up at the end of this month, and hopefully if that happens and we continue to decline in the number, I think we will be good to go. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kwame, for this interesting overview, and it's very encouraging to hear that recovery rates in some countries are very high. So let's hope that actually this continues further. Let me now move to Algeria and ask Yassine to give us a bit of an overview of the situation there, and also about the policy response to the COVID crisis.
Algeria is buying. I'm going quickly to present the economic and social measures and the nature of the impact of the COVID impact on the economic and social situation in Algeria. Algeria, as all of you know, it's an economy who is highly dependent on oil, and the COVID-19 shocks is linked to the decline, to the important or spectacular decline in the oil prices. Algeria is being hit by a dual shock, COVID and decline in oil prices. The government in this situation have to deal simultaneously with measures to cope with macroeconomic aggregate disequilibrium and a vulnerable and fragile social situation. Algeria economy is highly dependent on hydrocarbon resources. The IMF expects a rate of growth of 0.7% in 2019 and a decrease of about 5.2% in the end of 2020. The current account deficit will reach 18.3% in 2020, and the unemployment rate will be cut to 15.1% in 2020. The Unemployment Act actually is about 11%. The contraction in the oil tax revenue involved a decrease in the production and the global domestic demand, and also in the international trade. As a reaction of this situation, the government decided to cut out the current public spending by 50%. This important decrease in the current public spending will have an important impact on the economic situation. This cut out will reduce the government operating budget by about 15 to 17%. The least defavored social group will be the first one to be affected by this pandemic, as day laborers, workers in the informal sector, and the SMEs. In Algeria, the labor force is estimated to be 11 million. About 7 million are employed in the private sector, the sector who is the mostly impacted by the COVID-19, and only 37% of the labor are in the public sector. 35% of the employed population are considered in insecure and precarious statute because of the importance of the informal sector in the employment in Algeria. They are mainly concentrated in sector. This insecure and precarious employment is mainly concentrated in sector as water, building and service engineering, services, agriculture and fishing, and hotel industry. Algeria has adopted, as the majority of countries, a combined measure of fiscal and combined fiscal and monetary measures. For the fiscal measures, the government has committed about 70 billion dinar, is equivalent to 545 million USD dollar, to cope with the negative effect of the COVID-19. These amounts are mainly allocated to professional category who has lost their job and livelihoods, and to an important part is to direct cash transfer to about 2.2 million of population who are in a needy situation, and 19.1 billion of dinar as oriented to the health sector. Also, the government decided to postpone tax reporting for individuals and enterprises, and to reschedule the payment deadline for taxpayer and financial for taxpayers in financial difficulties. Contractual deadlines on public projects are relaxed and late penalties suspended. The monetary measures are concentrated in the reduction of the discount rate by or the director rate by 25%, and the reserve requirement ratio is reduced from 8% to 6%, and also an increase in the fund level of the marketable public securities by 5%. That's all about the situation in Algerian measure to cope with the COVID-19, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Yassine. I think one interesting point is that economies which relies on certain sectors may be more exposed to large impacts. So that's of course the case for economies depending on commodities export, like Algeria. But it came up also in other presentations. All those economies which rely heavily on tourism and hospitalities are going to be strongly hit. Let's now move to Lebanon with Sandra.
Hello, everyone. So I'm very happy to participate in this event. I will present the case of Lebanon. So in the case of Lebanon, actually, the country has been dealing with different crises before the COVID-19 crisis. So since October 2019, we have a social unrest and protests calling for accountability, over corruption and economic reform. And we also had have a banking crisis that has started a while ago, but what became more severe since November. And on March 9th, also the government had a first-time default on its debt. So all this in the context of high number of refugees, continuous political crisis, economic contraction. So as you imagine, the coronavirus crisis arrives in a very bad
Sandra? Sandra, can you hear me? Sandra, I think we cannot hear you anymore.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think I had a connection problem. So the first step was closing school very quickly after the first corona cases, and lockdown. Since the end of April, we have a lifting of the lockdown. On average, we had a relatively low number of deaths, and it is relatively with the no saturation of hospitals regarding the crisis occurring in the country. So we have also, after the lifting of the lockdown, we are having a lot of testing around the country, and support for the public healthcare system in Lebanon. The socioeconomic challenges, as you imagine, are numerous because the country is having one of its most severe crises since its establishment in 1920. So the IMF projection for the economic contraction
Sandra, we cannot hear you. I think you are experiencing a connections problem.
Yeah, I don't. Now better?
Now I can, yeah, let's try.
Yes, okay, sorry. So as we are seeing that the businesses are closing down in the country more and more, we have a high unemployment rate that started before the October crisis in the country, and it's becoming more and more severe. So you have more unemployed people, and the people who have the chance to be employed are having half salaries. All of this with a limited capacity of withdrawal of their money from the banks because of capital controls and limiting the withdrawal. And also we have a social safety net that is quasi inexistent. And all of this with the context of currency devaluation and hyperinflation. So we are starting to see a food crisis in the country. And people are starting to grow their own vegetables on the roof just to face the when the lockdown started to be lifted, we have protests are coming back on the street, increasing the likelihood of having again more and more number of infected people of the virus. We also are witnessing a decrease of remittances that were severe before the coronavirus crisis because of the banking crisis in the country. And now, given the economic situation and all over the world, globally, the remittances will decrease, and especially high number of remittances to Lebanon come from the GCC countries that are highly impacted also by the oil crisis. Another challenge for Lebanon is the severe brain drain, because you have more and more youth, educated youth who are leaving the country to find better opportunities, maybe because of the global crisis. They will have less opportunities elsewhere, and maybe they will be able to participate in the recovery of the country. I will go just about the recovery, last slide, about the recovery. So the government is engaged in an economic and financial plan in order to request a loan from the IMF. It aims to reduce the government imbalances, provide social safety net, and restructure the economy. There is a lot of critics for this plan, especially that it might have high austerity measures that will also amplify the difficulties for the citizens. There's also an attempt to control the food prices and support basic products such as oil and wheat. The civil society is highly implicated is doing a massive role in the country by raising awareness, collecting funds, and helping the population in need, as well as the international community is supporting the country with foreign aids to support the healthcare system, the education system, and also the National Poverty Targeting Program allows also distribution for food. This program has been criticized a little bit by the government because of the listing that have a lot of errors and is not targeting the people. So the government is working on improving the list. And well, to end on a positive note, regardless of everything is to be rebuilt in the country. So it can be an opportunity to build on more sustainable grounds than the previous rebuild of the country after the war. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sandra. So it's clear that the situation is very complicated in Lebanon, not only because of the COVID crisis. Let's now move to the two countries which are left, so Morocco and Egypt.
Thank you very much, Rim, for this organization. Thank you, Cinzia, and I am very happy to see all of you and hope to see you soon. Okay, so my presentation is about Morocco. So very quickly, we have few time. Okay, let me start. Okay. So the first COVID case in Morocco was confirmed at the beginning of March 2nd, and the state of emergency was set up very quickly on March 20th. So as you can see in this graph, so the virus has spread very quickly, rising from 33 cases on March 3 to 7,910 cases at the beginning of June. We have very good recovery rate. So we have at the beginning of June more than 60,000 persons recovered, and the number of deaths has reached in total in Morocco 151, and a few days ago we had one more dead. So these figures are quite encouraging. So we can say that the strict containments and also the proactive policy in terms of sanitary situation, in terms of health, was made very quickly, made it possible to contain the outbreak. And of course, the country is looking for a maximal safety to ease the lockdown. So Morocco is still in the lockdown, and we think that in maybe it could be eased in few days, but Morocco are still in confinement. So all this situation, so the lockdown has an impact on the economy. So what we observe, and it's always the same situation that we have almost in all countries in the world, it's shocks to both the demand and the supply side. And just to tell you that before the COVID, the domestic demand in Morocco was projected to rise by 4% in 2020. So this, it was before the COVID. So now the projections are revised downward. So we expect a huge shock in import, in domestic and foreign demand. And certain sectors are badly affected, mainly tourism, air transport, and the exporting sector, like the textile and the automotive. So we expect weak domestic demand from Morocco and also from the European Union import market for the European Union partner like Spain and France. So in this context, so the economic growth is expected to reach 2.3 in 2020, and we hope to have a rebound in 2020 and to have economic growth reaching 3.8. We are very optimistic, but this is a good news. So what the Morocco did in this emergency context, so to avoid this global crisis, so Morocco has and still have a very proactive approach, and central bank was very active. So very at the beginning, a national committee was implemented, and a special fund have been established. So this national committee, the objective of this committee, it was to monitor very deeply the evolution of the economic, health situation, social situation in Morocco, and to adopt adequate economic and social action. And this committee, this fund, a special fund, the COVID fund, reached $3 billion, and this represents almost 3% of the Moroccan GDP. And this fund supports families, health sector, and different economic sectors. So very quickly, the central bank kept its benchmark interest rates by 25 basis points to 2%, and we have implemented, the government implemented different measures to related to tax, dividends, bank credit repayment, and financial aid to assist employees in formal and informal sector both, and also financial support for small businesses and for SMEs. So without this proactive policy, thanks to this proactive policy, we have limited the health shock and also the economic shock. But there's still high uncertainty about the socio-economic impact on the most vulnerable people. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Najat. Also, to be very short, as mentioned earlier, of course, tourism and the reopening of borders and the possibility for tourists to come will be very important. Let me now move to the last country, Egypt. Shahir, please be short. Sorry, to want pressure it, so we are a bit late.
Thank you, Cinzia. I'll try to be very short. So this chapter of Egypt is prepared with my colleague Rasha Ramadan from Cairo University, and I'll tackle three main points very quickly. So first, in terms of the number of deaths and the number of cases recovered or confirmed, we're still, in terms of the number of cases, on the upward part of the slope. So still the number of cases is increasing exponentially. This, I mean, represents a threat to the health system in Egypt, especially when we compare the Egyptian case to other Arab countries. So in terms of the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people, we're doing slightly lower than the average Arab region, lower than Jordan, lower than Lebanon, than Tunisia, but slightly higher than Morocco. The same case for the number of physicians. So this is why it's a threat for the public health system in Egypt. And this applies also in terms of the public spending in terms of health. And this is, I mean, this explains why we have a lot of out-of-pocket health spending as percent to GDP, as you can see here on this graph, and it increases over time. So against this and this public health threat, what are the policies that have been adopted in the Egyptian case? So I mean, I'll not go into the details because it's very similar to what happened in other either Arab or African countries. So we have a decrease in the interest rate with some easing in terms of the credit limit for local banks, a fiscal stimulus package of 100 billion Egyptian pounds. Then the financial sector, also the CBE postponed for the loan payments for 6 months without interest. And in terms of the social policy, that was the most important thing, where the Ministry of Social Solidarity allocated more funds to the program of a social safety net called Takaful and Karama, so solidarity and dignity for people, especially women who are not working, and they increased the coverage of this program. And adding to this, the government developed a program for informal workers, but until now, definitely given the huge size of the informal employment in Egypt, in terms of coverage, they're not still all of them included. So some estimates say that this program covered only around 10% of the number of informal workers, so around 1 million informal workers. And it's a small amount of 500 Egyptian pounds, which is more or less $32. So that's mainly what happened at the macro policies level. In terms of measures, since the beginning, the government opted for a partial lockdown. So we have just a curfew between 8 to 9 p.m. depending on the period, to 5 to 6 p.m. depending also on the period. But again, most of the cinema, theaters, mosques, churches, university schools are closed until now. Borders as well. Some fines have been also promulgated for those who do not wear the masks in public spaces and in public transportation. And the government of Egypt concluded also with the IMF a rapid financing instrument of $2.7 billion to face COVID-19. To conclude, the issues that we still, have not been really concluded, and we're still debating this, is the story, the debate between no lockdown versus lockdown, because we know that no lockdown, it's safer, lockdown is safer, but again, it represents a cost for needy people, and that's why if we opt for a no lockdown, then it represents a threat for their health, but at the same time, it will let them work. So it's still debatable, and each scenario has its pros and its cons. We still have a lot of vulnerable categories: less educated people, young people, people who are working in low wage occupation, self-employed, women. So all these categories are still, especially also in rural areas, where we have a much less developed infrastructure in terms of health or in terms of education. And finally, to what extent the government will be able to improve health services in terms of coverage, in terms of spending, and in terms of the quality also, because recently, I mean this week, the government decided to impose some price limits on the private hospitals in order to let them provide the service at a lower price. So with this, I think I just covered some features of the Egyptian case, and thank you.
Rim, I hand it over to you for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, for managing this, I would say, sprint of presentations. Thank you for the speakers for very rich presentations. We're sorry we put you under pressure, but then we are constrained with time. Now I would like to move to the discussion. We have two discussants. I will start with Mohammed Razes because he has to leave. So please, Mohammed, the screen is yours. So please give us your comment on all these presentations and what the Union for Mediterranean is doing to promote and to contribute to the regional recovery. Mohammed.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thanks a lot, and sorry for rushing you, but I'll try to be very brief. First of all, thank you very much to EMEA, not only for this webinar, but for the great effort, the excellent effort with a series of webinars. We're very pleased always to engage actively with EMEA being a strategic partner. And I'm also very happy to share this short virtual panel with a friend and a great partner for the UFM Secretariat, namely Carlos Conde from OECD. So I can confidently say that since day one, the UFM Secretariat has not been watching at a distance or hand tight. Actually, we have been since day one intensifying our consultation both in-house and together with our strategic partners and stakeholders, with our co-presidency and with our member states, to make sure that we can accompany the ongoing and envisaged efforts both regionally and internationally. And here I'd like to mention some concrete issues. One of the first things that we did was to revisit our work program for the remaining part of 2020, making sure that whatever event or activity we would be undertaking would contribute to the post-pandemic recovery. Since day one, we have a task force and we have a dedicated section on our website to also share the endeavors undertaken by our partners, and here I can mention some names. I already mentioned EMEA, I mentioned OECD. So everything that they are doing and that we have been doing is showcased on our website and made accessible to our beneficiaries and stakeholders to make sure that there's a domino effect and that this is accessible to a larger spectrum of audience and beneficiaries. I can give you some examples on events that we have undertaken and that we are yet to undertake, but I'd like to highlight one very important event taking place on the 26th of June this month. And it's about social economy being one of the most resilient and smart models in post-pandemic and post-crisis setting in general, being responsive, responsible, inclusive, and sustainable. We very much look forward to this event. But our response has extended also to other fields, and here I can mention civic protection, I can mention water security, I can mention smart urban resilience, I can mention job creation and gender mainstreaming to the end of the very long list. Unfortunately, as you well know, the Euro-Mediterranean region is one of the regions most hardly hit by this pandemic, and this crisis took us unawares because unfortunately, as you well know, it's one of the least economically integrated regions in the whole world. However, history has taught us that behind every such global crisis, there lurks a golden opportunity, maybe a once-in-a-decade opportunity. We know that the post-pandemic economy will favor companies and businesses and enterprises that can combine agility with resilience, that can invest heavily in digital technologies and embrace all what has been spawned by the fourth industrial revolution. We also know that there will be opportunities brought about by the reconfiguration of supply chain models and value chains, bringing them closer to home for very obvious logistical and geostrategic and security motives. We also know that the case for a green or a low carbon economy transition becomes evident, becomes as clear as Euclid. And we hope to see this being finally realized in concrete terms on the ground. So to sum it up and to give time for the other colleagues, we have been following very closely the progress of this pandemic. It's not over yet. It might be some time before we can assess fully the policy impact in the region and beyond. But for the time being, we're very happy to accompany the efforts that you are undertaking. And please think of us as your platform and as your strategic partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I completely agree about the fact that social economy and also the green economy could be part and pillars for sustainable recovery. And let me say that at EMEA, we are working on it, and hopefully we will continue interacting on these two topics. So please, if you have comments on the policy tool, please give it to us, and then we will take this into consideration. Now, I would like to give the floor to Carlos Conde. Carlos, the screen is yours.
Yes, hello, thank you very much, Reem, and good afternoon to everybody. Congratulations to EMEA and all the participants for a very rich afternoon with a lot of information, a lot of elements to analyze and to discuss. And I really want to congratulate EMEA because this is very important. Being empirical and collecting all this information as you are doing and disseminating in such an open manner is essential. EMNES is EMEA is an independent platform of researchers. The rigor and the independence that you make in your work, it's very much needed in the region. It's very important input for governments, but also you are empowering people. You are empowering the organizations, the NGOs, the private sector, when they are enriching their understanding of the economic challenges. And also, I would say, promoting the necessary transformation and reforms in the region. So again, congratulations and thank you very much for this opportunity. In the OECD, as well as Mohammed was saying, for the Union for the Mediterranean, we have been very active since the beginning, making what we do better, which is collecting the data, observing what the countries are doing, what are the policies, and analyzing this in order to improve the quality of the policy making and even in some cases providing recommendations. I shared with you earlier today the link with our platform, and you can find a lot of materials on different policy areas, from environment to fiscal issues, from social areas to education, etc. And we are providing this information, thinking, as some of you have mentioned, that we are facing a very difficult situation and the crisis has damaged very much our economies, but there are also opportunities on that. And the relaunch plans and the recovery measures that some governments are already taking will be very important to build a new economic model. And we think this is particularly essential in the Mediterranean countries. I've been hearing very attentively to all the presentations, and I think there are some important lessons learned from the experience. And some of them are very positive. The governments of the region have reacted very well. And there is a very effective response to contain the pandemic with results that are very encouraging. But also we have seen that the institutions have been working. The governments have been coordinated. In the OECD, we have been making very extensive consultations in policy areas. And we have observed that it has worked at central level with good platforms of coordination and crisis management units in many governments, but also there has been a granularity. We have been consulting with investment agencies, with women councils, with different institutions, and we have seen that the response has trickled down, and there has been a good assessment of the situation and some measures that immediately have been taken. This is an important lesson for the future. I think we regularly talk about the deficit of implementation, and now the region has shown that it has a good capacity to deliver and to implement policies. It would be good that this is not only done in a situation of crisis, but is also done in a situation of normality. So I think this capacity of delivering, which is related to the administrative and governance model, we need to learn from this. Of course, there are also shortcomings and gaps. Some colleagues have mentioned the importance of digital. It's important to be better prepared for that. And I think the evidence that we have collected about the needs of for implementing better quality policies will incentivize going further in digital, for example. There is something that we have working closely with representatives from the private sector and business associations, and some countries have also built their responses in a, I would say, an open manner, making use of consultations, engaging with different stakeholders in defining the responses. And we think this is very much a necessity for improving the governance mechanisms in the region. We have seen that the private sector has been very damaged, but also has been a very important part of the response. There is plenty of innovative solutions and actions that have been taken by the private sector to deliver on goods that were needed, for example, but also the private sector has been essential to keep the social stability of the countries. And there has also a lot of good experiences in which companies have also paid a lot of attention to their social responsibility. Same thing goes to NGOs. We see, and we were looking to Lebanon, for example, we see societies in which the mobilization of the civil society has been very important. We need to be frank on that. The situation for civil society is not, I would say, equally distributed in we know that there are important restrictions in some countries. The collaboration with civil society NGOs is not always optimal. And regularly we hear about restrictions, for example, in the autonomy of organizations. I think this crisis needs also to invite us to revisit these models and encouraging governments really to be more open and providing more capacities to other actors to be part of the response. This is also the case for the private sector. As we are already thinking in the recovery plans, in which the role of the private sector will be essential, it's important to build the policy-making mechanisms that will be based on consultation and open exchange, and will be the addition of the value of different type of organizations. So I think this crisis needs to also move the way of doing policy, building on the very positive achievements and the positive outcomes, and the indicators of EMEA are very good in showing that even some countries from the region have better results than some OECD member countries. So it's important to also recognize that, but at the same time, let's also look into how to improve some areas that need some attention. We have been discussing essentially the responses to the pandemic, to the health crisis, and the immediate response. But now more and more, and I understand that EMEA in your platform, you will incorporate now more progressively more information about the recovery plans. And this is, of course, very important for the future. I think that, as many participants have underlined, this is an opportunity to build new economic models, greener, more based on digital, in the case of MENA with a better environment for the private sector, for business. This is not a new agenda. The agenda was already there, but this can be a powerful incentive. There are some elements that maybe will change. For example, I have the impression that everywhere there is a much more evidence about the need of reinforcing the welfare systems. For example, health, social protection, and in the response to the emergency, a lot has been done. Of course, now this needs to be sustainable, and more determined welfare policies need to be consolidated. But of course, there is an issue that has been mentioned by all participants about the fiscal sustainability and the economic conditions to make this possible. And obviously, this requires a stronger fiscal basis that can only come from an economy that is more competitive and is generating more resources and is generating more jobs. Again, this is not new, but now we have an opportunity and we have a powerful incentive to move into that direction. I would like to be very concrete, and there are two elements that we have been working very much in the OECD during the last couple of months. I share with you a couple on the impact of COVID on two areas that, in my opinion, are very important in this direction of building more competitive economies that will be able to generate the resources necessary for a different economic and social model. One is investment and the linkages between the economies of the region and the global economy. And the second one is women economic empowerment and the situation of women in COVID and after COVID. Concerning investment, we believe that a stronger linkage between the MENA economies and the global economy through better environment for international investment and better trade policies can make a difference in building a model that is more resilient, but is also able to generate the very large number of jobs that the region needs. We have been consulting with all the investment authorities of the region, and I invite you to read the paper where you will see a lot of very good things that are taking place, a very immediate response in a situation that is certainly challenging. All the estimations announce a very significant decline in the foreign investment in the immediately in the, I would say, the most immediate period, but also there are probably opportunities, and we know that all the countries are looking very attentively to the global debate on the repositioning of the global chains and how the region should be better equipped and better placed for the likely restructuring on the functioning of the global chains. On that, more analysis is needed, and actually I'm glad that we were together discussing this afternoon with Mohammed, because the UFM and the OECD will launch a joint report about the impact of COVID that will have a very important focus on this, on how the region will, what are the elements that can help to position better the Mediterranean region in this global movement that the COVID has shown that it's the object of reflection and probably policy changes. So this is an area in which the economic thinking of the countries in the region need to focus to build on the conditions that will reinforce their capacity to take advantage of the comparative advantages of the region that are many. Second element concerns women economic empowerment. And this is not something peripheral. We have been talking for years saying that the competitiveness of the region relies very much on the massive incorporation of women to the economic life, to the private sector, in transforming the major progress that has taken place on the educational level in access to the labor market and better capacities for the women to become as well entrepreneurs. So this movement of this transformation of the region into a more private sector led goes, in our opinion, by reinforcing the role of the women. And COVID also has shown a lot of things. First of all, that the women, and this is a global trend, not only in MENA, are a fundamental part of the response, as more of the care systems rely almost not entirely, but in a very large percentage on women. But also that women have been particularly damaged by the crisis. They are more affected by informal employment. They are less covered by social support. But in addition, there is something that it has happened everywhere, and as well in MENA, which is the significant increase of domestic violence against women in a situation where confinement, of course, has put the family at the center, let's say, of the life of every individual. On that, we have observed some positive developments. Again, in the policy response, we have seen that many countries in the region have taken specific measures in support of women, especially on issues related to domestic violence, but also that some of the institutional platforms or risk management crisis groups that have been created by governments have incorporated the women institutions to incorporate some gender lens into the policy response. This is positive, although it's insufficient. We see that most of the measures that you have been discussing this afternoon do not incorporate, in most of the cases, a gender consideration. And mainstream should have been much more prominent in this response. I think we still are in time of improving this response, and we very much encourage all governments to take this very seriously, because this is a condition for a sustainable recovery. So I'm not exhaustive. I'm not saying that investment and gender are the only aspects. You have mentioned many others, but I wanted to highlight some areas that are of particular interest in our opinion, that we have documented and in which we think good progress we can do making use of the COVID crisis as an incentive for further reform. So to sum up, let's again put governance at the center of the preoccupation, and let's do it with optimism, because we have seen that countries in the region have a good capacity of reaction and have shown good capacities. These capacities can also be channeled to policy objectives, and let's do it in an open governance and democratic governance manner, incorporating the views of different people, of the private sector, of the NGOs and the civil society, with the support of platforms such as EMEA, that in such an efficient manner mobilizes the knowledge, the independent knowledge of the region. Let's work harder on a better integration of the MENA economies into the world economies. Let's not listen to this sirens music about protectionism and closing the borders as the solution, because this will not be the solution. This will impoverish societies. And finally, again, let's put women empowerment at the center of the policy responses. This is not only an issue of fairness and human rights, this is a fundamental economic issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think you summarized very much what is the agenda for the post-recovery. And I think I would certainly emphasize the role of digitalization, which was carefully mentioned by Rim at the beginning. Also the green economy, women empowerment, how to bring back foreign direct investment in a more sustainable manner for the countries, a new model for regional integration based on global value chain rethought in a certain way. And let me say something which, in fact, at EMEA, we are, and EMNES, we are working on a research on that. So if we can be useful on your discussion with the UFM on the global value chain, please do not hesitate to let us know. But also, I think, as Mohammed said, and he left the social economy, it's extremely important as well. And I think, thank you very much for this really overview, which in fact gives a very good, I would call agenda, research agenda for us, for EMNES and EMEA, to be able to continue into our monitoring exercise and research exercise. But also you mentioned something extremely important, which is the collaboration and coordination between all actors. And I think this will really enhance the efficiency of the efforts and resources used between all the stakeholders. But beyond this, and you mentioned, and I completely agree, the role of the private sector. And I think the private sector has to step into the way forward as a solution rather than as a problem. Now, I have a couple of questions to the panelists and also to whoever is interested to answer. One first question to Cinzia. You mentioned the recovery plan for Europe, and this is quite comprehensive. I mean, when I saw the proposal, it has been really extremely, comprehensive, but also very ambitious. Do you think this proposal will be approved by the European Parliament and the European Council? The second question is, going beyond this, the suspension of the state aid rules and the fiscal rules. I think this is quite ambitious and very, I would say, bold, knowing how the European Union functions. Do you think this is going to pass? And if it will pass, for how long do you think this is going to be the case? And the third question to you is, you mentioned that there will be this financing mechanism. Who will issue this financial instrument? This is my question, and I would like to give you the screen quickly because I know that you have to leave. I need answers, please.
So very quickly on the three questions. Let me start with the easiest one, which is the one on the suspension of fiscal rules and the state aid rules. So this is clearly temporary, yeah? Because this is suspension of key principles of the single market for state aid, and fiscal rules is for the fiscal governance. But it's a clear sign of the size of the magnitude of the crisis, which really required basically measure which at the same time were never applied before, basically. And also put it under the spotlight the fact that the government had to have the freedom to inject money and to offer support to companies and also to individuals, to households, basically all those in need. I think this is going to stay for a while. So we do not know. I mean, there is no end to the suspension. We only know that that is temporary. So there will be a large degree of judgment, if you want, to basically say when the suspension will be basically removed and we go back to a normal regime. The second one on the ambitious plan of the European Commission. I had the chance to speak to some MEPs, and the mood in the Parliament is rather positive. So this is actually the first time where there is quite broad backing for such a bold program in the European Parliament across parties and across member states. So very different with respect to the financial crisis, where basically some countries were seen more as sinners and didn't deserve necessarily help or conditionality to get the help. Now the approach is quite different. I mean, of course, this needs to be approved by the Council. In the Council, there is quite some splits with the southern member states and then the frugals, so the Nordic. But the Merkel and Macron proposal actually was a complete watershed. So the change in position on France and Germany and the openness actually to go for a bold action was a complete game changer. So, I mean, of course, we need to see how the negotiations will go, and devil is in the details. So a lot of technical issues will have to be discussed. But for the moment, the impression is that the attitude is quite positive. Third, who is going to borrow? So this is, there are a number of technical issues, but basically the idea is that the EU is borrowing with the EU budget as a guarantee for basically the issuance of bonds, which will be EU bonds. So not Euro bonds, really EU bonds in the full sense of term, where basically it's not joint liabilities of the countries, but it's the EU as an entity with its budget behind the bonds. And this is, in a sense, is a complete breakthrough and a taboo which has been broken, if, of course, the proposal goes through. Thanks.
Thank you, Cinzia. That gives me hope for further integration at the EU level. I think we're moving really, if of course this proposal is adopted, we will move into further economic and political integration in the EU. And I think this is very, very welcome development. And we haven't seen it in the credit and banking crisis in 2008. I think we're moving beyond. But when we look at the answers or recovery plans for all the South Mediterranean countries, and also if we look at the Ghana case, it is clear to me that every country is going by its own way. I mean, there is no what I call I would say a regional versus even global answer to this. And I think this high level of fragmentation might be probably detrimental to the recovery path. There is another question I want to give to the panelists, and whoever wants to answer, please raise the hand. It's about the decline of remittances. The remittances have been declining. We've seen the numbers in the World Bank, the latest numbers of March. So let me see, for example, what is the view from Tunisia on remittances? Because Rim, you mentioned experts, you mentioned tourism. I haven't seen that you mentioned the remittances. Does this mean that you haven't seen a decline in Tunisia? Rim, I don't see her. Maybe she has left. Okay, no problem. So what about Egypt?
Well, I think, Reem, in terms of remittances, definitely we have a strong decline because most of the Egyptians who work abroad, they work in GCC countries, and with the declining prices of oil, so this will be another, I mean, an extra layer for the macroeconomic shock that we're facing now. And this also questions to what extent the transfers made by the government, either through Takaful and Karama or through the this new program for informal workers, will help people to curb the negative effects of this extra shock. But definitely, we're going to have not only, I mean, a decline of remittances because of the COVID-19, but also because of the decline in oil prices in the GCC countries, where most of the Egyptians are working.
Yes, thank you. And what about Lebanon?
Yes, as I said, actually Lebanon has been witnessing decrease in remittances for a while now because of the banking crisis existing, and now with the GCC countries, oil crisis also will have a significant decrease in remittances. So we don't trust anymore the banking system to send the money via the banking system. And in the same time, we are afraid that a lot of Lebanese will lose their jobs in the GCC countries or in other countries and go back home to increase the unemployment rate again.
Thank you. There was one question which I would like to raise very quickly, is about the corruption pre and post-COVID. Who wants to answer to this?
So again, Rim, let me just make a point quickly here on corruption. I think this whole COVID thing definitely has given opportunity for corruption, because there's a lot of movement to the internet, okay, where that's where a lot of fraud happens. Now, people are also looking at saying that any request they have that they attach COVID to it, it's seen a bit more favorably. So again, I think governments who are looking to really be effective with their COVID response must be very aware of cyber fraud and corruption in nature, because people are going to try to take advantage of it, because I think there's a bit of an emotional sense to the whole COVID pandemic, and also the uncertainty around it makes it a bit emotional. So my suggestion is that it's alive, is well, so we should be aware of it and take measures accordingly.
Thank you very much, Kwame. There was another question on the impact on the non-performing loans and financial stability. Who wants to take this question? Impact on the non-performing loans and financial stability. Maybe, I see, maybe, for example, Nooh. Okay, no one wants to take.
I think, Doctor. So let me try. I think for Ghana specifically, okay, if you look at the measures that has been taken by our central bank, it's clear that they expect businesses. So for hotels, for example, hotels have basically closed down. Major hotels. Some of them are using borrowed funds. They use their revenues to pay. Now they're not going to be able to pay. So it's definitely going to be, there's going to be non-performing loans is definitely going to grow. So I'm glad to see that the central bank has taken a proactive measure to ease some of these so that it doesn't become a pandemic. Now, a good thing that they're also doing is that they are taking case by case for each customer to really look at your situation, to review, to see how best the banks can help with work with you. And then also, all banks must now present a report, in the case of Ghana, to the central bank to deal with how they're dealing with IFRS 9 and all these things. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kwame. I just want to give some answers on this non-performing loans. Clearly, for example, if we look at the case in Europe, there has been moratoria and then accelerated procedures for granting loans. So if you look at, for example, at the Eurozone, there has been an increase of more than 200 billion over between March and April of the volume of credit. This, of course, will have serious implications on over-indebtedness of individuals and on the SME sector. But beyond this, this will mean that the NPL, especially in countries like, for example, in Italy or possibly also in Spain and Greece, will have much more difficulties to deal with this. And now, obviously, there are several proposals eventually to reduce this NPL, trying also to inject equity into the small and medium-sized enterprise capital to rebalance, the capital structures of those companies. So I believe that this is also part of the recovery, and I believe that over time, many solutions will have to be explored, but then it will put further pressure on the finances of the countries at the government level. And with this, I would like to thank all the panelists, all the speakers. Thank you very much, Cinzia, for co-moderating this panel. It was a long one. We managed to do it in, say, a little bit more than almost 2 hours. Okay, we were not great with time. I would like to thank very much the discussants for giving us very nice ideas and very comprehensive ideas for our future agenda setting. And also we will try as EMEA and EMNES to contribute to the overall, I would call, information giving to the citizens, but also in terms of research, informed research, independent research, that will allow us all to learn from this very difficult experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and its socioeconomic implications. But now we're already talking about recovery. So the next webinar, it will be on the 18th of June, and it will tackle one important issue, which is the over-indebtedness at government level, debt relief, because we want to focus on the countries that are asking for debt relief, especially in Africa, and transparency. I think this is also important and might even tackle the issue of corruption. So thank you very much. And also I would like to thank all the audience. I know this has been a bit long. I see the list decreasing every, I think after 1 hour and a half. So I hope this was useful for you this afternoon. I would like to ask everybody to switch his camera so we can have a group picture for whoever is remaining. Kinga, you tell me.
Let me use this time to thank everyone, to thank Reem for the organization of this webinar, and to thank Kinga for the technical assistance and to make it possible, and also George for all the coordination.
That's great. Thank you all the team for this. Please, whoever, yes, we are getting the cameras. Please, whoever can switch off, on the camera, on. Yes, we are
to see you how you are at home.
Yes. I think we are now, we have to interact virtually. That's okay. Anyhow, thank you very much. And then please, George and Kinga, take the pictures. And I would like to say goodbye, and I will see you all in 2 weeks. Here you go.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank
Bye
you,
bye.
Reem. Thank you for everything. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.